Okay, so we're going to start. So welcome everyone to the UN Behavioral Science Week. Our session is on the impact of judicial well-being on judges' behavior and judicial integrity. And in a few minutes, we're going to have 3 talks. The first is by Tatiana Varus, the Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Officer at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, where she coordinates the activities of the Global Judicial Integrity Network. The second talk is by Carly Shriver and Sally Ryan, the Judicial Wellbeing Advisors at the Judicial College of Victoria, Australia. And then finally, we're going to have Peter Jamadar, Chair of the Caribbean Association of Judicial Officers, Judge of the Caribbean Court of Justice, and the Vice Chair of Programming at the Commonwealth Judicial Education Institute. And can I just remind everyone to mute themselves? Can everyone please mute themselves? Thank you. Great. Great. Okay. So I'm the chair of this session. My name is Tali Sharot, and I'm a professor of cognitive neuroscience at University College London. So my work mixes in psychology, neuroscience, and behavioral economics. And for the first few minutes, I'm going to share with you one example of how mental states can impact cognitive processes that are involved in judicial work. And so if you think about the work of the judge on a daily basis, a judge receives information, either verbally or in written form, and then this information is processed by the judge's brain to form a belief, which then leads to a decision, a judgment. Therefore, the mental state of the judge is crucial because we know that the mental state will impact how information is processed and how it's used to make decision. So things like the mood of the judge, fatigue, all of these are going to be quite important. So one thing that is especially important to consider is stress, the amount of stress that the judge is under. And this is because we know that stress really alters the way that the brain functions, and it alters the way that we process information. And stress doesn't only impact those deep structures in our brain that are important for emotion, it actually impacts the function of the brain as a whole, including regions in our frontal lobes, which are really important for processing information and making decisions. And one thing that it does, it makes us hypervigilant to negative information. So let me tell you about one study that we've done that kind of looks at how stress alters the way that we process information. We were specifically interested in how stress changes the way that we process information about risk. And we brought people into our lab and we wanted to stress them out. So these were students, and we told them that they're going to have to give a talk about a surprise topic that we will give them. They're going to be judged and rated. We're going to videotape them. We're going to put them on YouTube. So our volunteers got quite stressed. They told us that they were stressed. We also measured their cortisol in their saliva. When you're stressed, your cortisol goes up. And I just want to remind everyone to mute themselves. Thank you. We also measured their skin conductance. When you stress, you start sweating and skin conductance goes up. And all these indicators showed that our volunteers were quite stressed. And once we realized, okay, they're stressed, we asked them to estimate the likelihood of all sorts of negative events happening. What is the likelihood of being a victim of card fraud? What is the likelihood of being in an accident? What is the likelihood of having illnesses, of having the likelihood of being for example, getting divorced and so on. So they put in their estimates, and then we gave them information about the average likelihood in their population of having this event happen. So for example, being a victim of card fraud can be about 70% in different populations. And then we asked them again, okay, now that you received this information, what do you think? What is the likelihood of being a victim of card fraud? So what we were interested in is whether people will take in the information to alter their beliefs and how stress will change this process. We also had another group of participants that we didn't stress them. They just came in and they just did the experiment. What we found that those individuals that were quite relaxed, that were not asked to give a talk, they tended to disregard negative information relatively. So for example, if someone said, I think my likelihood of being a victim of card fraud is about 30%, and we said, hey, bad news, the likelihood of being a victim of card fraud is much higher. It's about 70%. The next time around, they said, yeah, I think for someone like me living in my city and so on, it's only about 33%. So they tended to disregard negative information. But this was completely different for people that were under stress. The more stressed someone was, the more likely they were to take in this unexpected negative information to alter their beliefs, such that those individuals who were really stressed said, oh, in that case, 100% likelihood of being a victim of card fraud. They overestimated the probabilities. And we saw the same in firefighters in the state of Colorado. The reason that we looked in firefighters is that firefighters have days that they were quite relaxed, sitting in their station, cleaning their engines, and some days that they had life-threatening events, so they were very stressed. And we gave them our task of estimating risk and then giving them information while they were on duty. And what we found is the more stressed the firefighter was, the more likely they were to take in the information that we gave them, the negative information, and alter their beliefs. And for positive information, we didn't find any significant effect. If anything, it was the other direction. So what this means is that the more stressed a person is, the more likely they are to take in and learn from negative information. And the interesting thing is that our participants, whether it was the firefighters or the students, they were stressed for reasons that were unrelated to the information that we gave them. They were stressed because they had to give a talk. They were stressed because they had some life-threatening event happening that morning. And yet, that stress was generalized and impacted the way that they then processed information in our task. So you can see how this relates to global stressful events, like a market collapse or a terrorist attack or a pandemic. Under those circumstances, people get quite stressed. And so that changes the way that the brain functions, and it starts focusing on negative information, of which at the time there's a lot of. And that can actually cause people to become overly pessimistic and make suboptimal decisions. So for example, after a market collapse, people tend to sell their stocks rather than hold on, which is what they should be doing. After a terrorist attack, people cancel flights and get into the car, where actually driving is more dangerous than flying. And it turns out that how stressed you are also relates to how old you are. So stress starts quite low in teenagers and kids, and it goes up, 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 reaches peak in midlife, and that starts going down again. And if you look at the tendency to learn from bad news, you see the exact same pattern. The ability to learn from unexpected negative information is quite low in teenagers and kids, and it goes up, 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 reaches peak in your midlife, and then starts going down again, potentially because stress is quite enhanced in midlife. And happiness goes the other way. So happiness starts quite high and goes down, 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 reaches rock bottom in your midlife, but the good news is then starts going up again. So what this means is if an individual is stressed for whatever reason, a global event such as a pandemic, personal event, those stress will creep into the workplace and change the way that information is processed. And so this is just one example of how mental state can affect the cognitive processes that are important for judgment and decision making. So to hear more about how judges' well-being, why it is important and how to improve it, we're going to turn to our next speakers. And the first speaker is Tatiana Varus. And I just want to mention before Tatiana comes up that if you have any questions throughout the whole session, please put it in the chat. We're going to have at least 20 minutes at the end for discussion and answering questions. So do so, but just leave your microphones muted. Great. So Tatiana, we are going to.
Hello, everyone. I am just waiting for the slides. 1 second. It is an honor to be here today, and in the next couple of minutes, I would like to share with you a little bit about our work in the Global Judicial Integrity Network on the topic of judicial well-being, and especially how well-being or the lack of well-being affects judges' ability to work, to deliver results, to be fair, and to ultimately act with integrity that is expected of every judge. In case you are not familiar with the network, it is an initiative of UNODC that serves as a platform for judges and judiciaries to come together and jointly identify and address various judicial integrity and ethical challenges that they might face. We started focusing on the topic of judicial well-being during the pandemic, which, as we all know, took its toll on mental health of many people. But the pandemic has also helped open the discussion on the topic. And for instance, many companies and also public offices and judiciaries have become more aware of how stress might affect their employees or public officials. But the relevance of judicial well-being and judicial stress is, of course, not new and precedes the pandemic. And in fact, already the 2007 commentary on the Bangalore Principles of Judicial Conduct, which is one of the key international standards on judicial integrity, it explicitly recognizes that judicial stress is an issue and should be addressed, and that judges should have enough opportunities to maintain their optimal well-being. In the network, we wanted to find out how this works in reality. If judges indeed have enough opportunities to maintain their well-being, and if not, how or if it affects their work, and what type of support they would need. So last year, we conducted a global survey and very recently published a report analyzing all the responses from 750 judges from 102 countries. And now I would like to share with you some of the findings. First, there are many factors that negatively affect well-being of judges, but from the survey, it seems that the most common one is very high workloads. Judges generally deal with many cases simultaneously under tight deadlines with limited time available to spend on research, which then means that judges very often have to work from home and use their free time to write decisions. Plus, it also seems that often there is a lot of pressure from the management to meet certain quotas, and judges often feel that no matter what they do, they are always behind. Second, it was frequently reported that there is still a lot of stigma around mental health in judiciaries. Judges often fear to admit that they are overworked, that they experience stress, as they don't want to be seen as weak or incompetent. In fact, around 70% of the judges said that it was still a taboo to talk about mental health and stress is experienced by judges in their judiciary. Then some other findings are that 76% of judges reported that they do not have time to maintain their physical and mental well-being. More than 90% regularly experience stress, and also more than 90% would appreciate some guidance or training on how to improve their well-being. Through the survey, we were interested to learn about how the lack of well-being impacts on judicial performance, judicial behavior, and integrity of judges. And we found, as you can see, that the lack of well-being, of course, creates limitations to efficiency of justice, quality of decisions, public trust in the judiciary, access to justice, integrity, or procedural fairness. And as one judge said in the survey, if judges are not functioning optimally, both physically and mentally, then of course they cannot perform optimally or interact optimally with their colleagues or court users. It was also underlined that stress, burnout, fatigue, or anxiety are simply not compatible with the judicial values of independence, impartiality, competence, or diligence. Some concrete negative consequences of frequent stress and anxiety that were reported include overall bad performance, frequent mistakes, errors in judgment, lack of concentration, slowness, even anger, decreased ability to stay open and be receptive to submissions, lack of empathy, indifference, resorting to stereotypes or biases, interpersonal problems, or even the lack of energy to try to maintain good relationships with public, such as through different educational activities. Through the survey, we also tried to increase our understanding of what judges actually need to promote their well-being. And first of all, it is to acknowledge the issue and show understanding and compassion, in particular by judicial leadership. We should remove stereotypes and stigma and instead promote dialogue and a safe space for everyone to speak. And secondly, judges need actual support. According to the survey, 54% of judiciaries provide no support. And even those that do, it is often only occasional pamphlets or occasional lectures on narrow topics such as health and nutrition, but not much more. In fact, 97% of judges thought that more prominence should be given in the judiciary to promoting well-being of judges. And as for the forms of support that would be welcomed by judges, these include access to psychological counseling with trained professionals who actually understand the specific stressors of judicial work, and also other opportunities for mentoring, coaching, team building, exercise classes, yoga or relaxation sessions, nature trips, or any other activities that help remove feelings of isolation, but rather create a culture of sharing. The survey participants would also welcome training that would be tailored to the specific needs of different judicial roles, focusing on topics such as resilience, personal growth, or stress management. The survey participants would also find as useful more flexibility in working arrangements, which to a certain degree was a positive side effect of the pandemic, such as the possibility to work partially from home, have more flexible working hours, better holiday policies, or parental support. So the survey revealed much more than this, but in interest of time, I will stop here, and you are most welcome to read the full report and to learn more about the network on our website. But in conclusion, I would like to say that there is some progress and more attention is being paid to the topic of judicial well-being in comparison to several years ago. And you will hear shortly more about good practices in Australia and in the Caribbean region. But certainly for many judiciaries, it is still a task ahead to try to foster an enabling work environment and to be aware that when people work with peace and happiness, they can concentrate better, interact better, deliver better results, and achieve better performance. And also, importantly, to improve trust in the judiciary and perception of the judiciary. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tatiana, for sharing the results of your survey. And we're going to move next to our talk, which is a joint talk by Carly Shriver and Sally Ryan, who are joining us from Australia.
Thank you, Tali, and thank you, Tatiana. I was so impressed when I saw the report on the UNODC's Judicial Wellbeing Survey, and it was wonderful to hear your summary of the findings just now. The thing that struck me so profoundly was how similar the key findings are from your global survey to the findings from my own research with the Australian judiciary. What this says to me is that while there are many differences for judges in terms of socio-political context, legal frameworks, conditions of service, etc., there is a commonality of judicial experience across the globe that connects judicial officers everywhere, which is why events such as this are so meaningful. It really is an honour to be invited back to participate in a Global Judicial Integrity Network webinar on this important topic of judicial wellbeing, specifically its impact on judges' behaviour and judicial integrity. In our short presentation, Sally and I want to share with you just a slice of the findings arising from my research project on judicial stress and wellbeing in Australia, and then talk about how courts and individual judges can make use of this research to support judicial wellbeing. But before we do that, I just want to say a few words about why we care about judicial wellbeing. Why is it important? Well, behavioural science research would suggest that it's important for principally three reasons. It's important for judicial officers because stress undermines an individual's psychological and physical health. It's important also for court users, including litigants, legal professionals and court staff, because behavioural science research has conclusively shown that stress undermines our capacities for emotion regulation and impulse control, making it more likely that we will behave in ways that we later regret. And I also think it's important for the integrity of judicial decisions, and this has been touched on by Tali and Tatiana, because behavioural science also shows us that stress undermines our objectivity and critical thinking, leading to more stereotypical and conservative decisions and decisions that preserve the status quo. And just to illustrate this final point, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this rather famous study of parole decision makers from Israel. It's now 10 years old, which found that parole was significantly more likely to be granted at the start of the working day, after morning tea and after lunch. And as the decision makers became fatigued and depleted of blood sugar, they were increasingly likely to make the conservative status quo decisions of denying parole. So because it's important, we have to talk about it and we have to safeguard it. And to safeguard it, we have to understand what drives it. This was the motivation for my recent PhD research on judicial stress and wellbeing in Australia, which involved 152 judicial officers from 5 Australian courts and sought to answer these three questions. Firstly, are judicial officers stressed compared to lawyers and the general population? Secondly, which judicial officers are most stressed and why? And finally, how could courts respond? To answer these questions, the study brought together 3 pieces of data. Firstly, measures of stress, which included validated measures of general psychological distress, mental ill health, burnout and secondary trauma. Also measures of basic psychological needs satisfaction, that is the satisfaction for our basic needs of autonomy, competence and relatedness, and more about that in a minute. And finally, judicial demographics. To better understand the drivers of judicial stress and wellbeing, we were interested in the relationships among these 3 groups of variables, in particular whether judicial stress levels vary according to levels of basic psychological needs satisfaction or demographic groupings. For today's short presentation, I just want to say a little bit more about the 3 basic psychological needs, as I expect many of you are wondering, what does that even mean? Basic psychological needs theory arises from a very well-established and heavily researched theory of human motivation and well-being called self-determination theory. At its core, self-determination theory contends that our well-being is a function of the extent to which our basic psychological needs of autonomy, competence and relatedness are satisfied within our environment. Autonomy refers to the need to feel authentic, self-determining, volitional, as opposed to controlled, coerced or pressured. And in essence, this speaks to the innate human need to feel free. So for judicial officers, this could mean experiencing some sense of control over workflow and work type within the context of manageable workloads. Competence refers to our need to feel capable and confident and effective, as opposed to inept or self-doubting or ill-equipped. And this really speaks to our innate need to feel worthy. So for judicial officers, this could mean having the training, experience and necessary support to confidently manage the cases and make the decisions that come before you. And finally, relatedness refers to our need to experience intimacy and genuine connection with others, as opposed to social exclusion and isolation. And it really speaks to our need to belong. So for judicial officers, this could mean feeling able to be yourself among colleagues and share authentically the human dimension of judging, rather than feeling the need to always be in role. And it might also include opportunities to work alongside colleagues from time to time. According to basic psychological needs theory, these needs are more fundamental than desires or ideals. They're considered what they call essential nutriments for psychological health and wellbeing. And indeed, a large-scale study of lawyer stress in the US recently found that basic psychological needs satisfaction correlated more strongly with lawyer wellbeing than really anything else, than demographics, personal life choices, and external indicators of success and status, leading them to conclude that it may not be possible for lawyers to experience thriving without relative satisfaction of all of these needs. But we didn't know to what extent this was true for judicial officers, which is why we included it in the research. So the findings of the study were many and varied, as you might imagine, but for today, I just want to emphasise 3 of them. The first is that, yes, judicial officers in Australia are stressed. This is a very real issue, and I am convinced it's an issue around the globe. In Australia, their rates of general distress, burnout, and especially secondary trauma were significantly higher than the general population. However, their rates of mental ill health, so depressive and anxious symptoms, were on a par with the general population, which is dramatically lower than the rest of the legal profession, where rates of depression, for example, are about 3 times the national average. So this suggested that there is a stress problem among the Australian judiciary, but so far this is not manifesting as a widespread mental health problem. The second finding was that judicial officers in the high volume summary court, so in Australia that's the magistrates' courts, they're the ones that experience the most stress. There was no relationship between stress and any of the other demographic variables, including practice area or seniority. Jurisdiction alone was related to variations in judicial stress, with magistrates significantly more stressed and burned out than judges. And finally, the kicker is that judicial stress was predicted by basic psychological needs satisfaction, especially relatedness. In fact, magistrates' higher levels of stress compared to judges were almost entirely explained statistically by their lower levels of basic psychological needs satisfaction. So there is something about the work and working conditions of the lower courts that makes it harder for judges in those courts to experience autonomy, competence and relatedness. And this was leading to measurably higher stress levels. Of the 3 needs, relatedness appears to be the most important for judicial wellbeing. This is not what I expected. It was the strongest unique predictor of judicial stress. Judges who report having a greater number and more satisfying collegial relationships, though those that reported feeling included, socially connected and able to be themselves with colleagues, had measurably less stress than those who felt more isolated and or inauthentic at work. So the upshot of all this is that if we can find ways to enhance judges' sense of autonomy, competence, and especially relatedness at work, we can expect to directly reduce the levels of stress. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Sally to talk about the ways in which individual judges and courts as workplaces can think about enhancing judicial relatedness.
Thank you, Carly, and hello everyone. As Carly said, I'm going to speak about how to foster relatedness, as we know this is such a strong predictor of judicial wellbeing. It's important to say at the outset that Carly and I see this task as a shared responsibility between individual judges, courts as workplaces and judicial leaders. And I'm just going to describe for a few minutes some of the examples of how these 3 parties can contribute to enhancing relatedness. And this is really about creating quite consciously opportunities for judges to be real and genuine with each other, to talk and connect professionally and personally. And if this is not possible, judicial officers can feel increasingly isolated and feel very heavily the weight of individual responsibility for their role. So what can courts do? Courts can develop structures and opportunities for professional and personal connection. And some examples of how this happens around the globe, and particularly what we have been focusing on in Victoria, is by bringing judges together through opportunities for judicial education about either legal aspects, skill building, in court craft, or quite directly through discussion about judicial wellbeing. We also have found the opportunities to come together in facilitated peer discussion groups to be really helpful. And so Carly and I have, over the last couple of years, brought small groups of judges together at similar career stages to talk about how they experience their role, to reflect on satisfactions and the challenges of being a judge. Judicial peer support is also an important capacity that courts can foster. And this can be done by providing education for judges about how to recognise colleagues who might be distressed, how to then have a supportive conversation with them. Some courts in Victoria also have judicial officers who have a wellbeing portfolio or who are identified as having done judicial peer support training. What about judicial leaders? What's their role in enhancing relatedness? Judicial leaders are key, and they help to create an environment where there's a sense of community and a real sense of belonging in courts. Judicial leaders can do this by leading with sincerity and authenticity, and as Tatiana said, a depth of compassion. They can help shape meaning for others by focusing attention on really meaningful and value-driven aspects of the work and the role. And really importantly, they can create systems for change that can support manageable workflow and workloads for judges. They can also lead and advocate for systems of support. I think Tatiana talked about this as well. So leaders can advocate for and put in place clinical and health professionals who can support judges in their jurisdictions. And finally, what about the individual judicial officer's role? What can they do to enhance relatedness? Individuals can challenge themselves to stamp out incivility, or conversely, to cultivate civility in their own relationships. We know that negative interactions more strongly affect wellbeing than positive ones. So it's important to try to reduce of negative behaviours and attitudes that can come across in sarcasm, disrespect and condescension. Judges can challenge themselves to do that and eradicate that from their own behaviour, their own chambers and within their own courts. And on the flip side of that, they can really focus on developing high quality relationships that are characterised by trust, information sharing, self-disclosure, empathy for others, and listening. They can incorporate regular and brief chances to talk to colleagues each day and have some responsibility for understanding and recognising their own signs of stress and proactively seeking support from colleagues and health professionals when they pick that up. We're all social beings, and I think safe and meaningful relationships help us to all emotionally regulate, and from this position we can bring our best selves to our work. And we certainly know from Carly's research that when relatedness is enhanced through all of these different mechanisms, we can expect a measurable increase in judicial wellbeing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally and Carly. We're going to move on to our last talk by Peter Jamadar. And I just want to remind everyone that after this talk, we're going to have time for discussion. So any comments or questions, just put them now in the chat. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Tali and Tatiana. In the Caribbean, we also did in 2019 and 2020 research on judicial wellness, and a lot of it is corroborated by the subsequent GJIN global survey and its findings. But what I want to share with you and chat about today is something a little bit different. It's related to behavioral science, and it's about whether mindfulness as intentional awareness could influence behavioral change in judicial officers in relation to core judicial functions in the courtroom, with a focus on procedural fairness. We've already heard that procedural fairness is important in the context of judicial wellness, but this is a shift in a sense, but it remains within the domain of behavioral change. And as you will soon see, it's related to integrity. So if I could just continue to explain to you that one of the roles that I play is as a judicial educator. I've been doing this for many, many years. In fact, right now I'm in Halifax with the Commonwealth Judicial Education Institute, running their intensive study program for judges from across the Commonwealth. And one goal of judicial education a significant goal is transformative behavioral change. And this for us is a matter of integrity. Integrity because if judicial behavior and judicial mindsets are not aligned with core judicial values, then there is a lack of judicial integrity. And so behavioral change seeks to bring about that alignment, and it is a goal of judicial education. The years of experience that we've had in judicial education, and especially in effecting behavioral change, has led us to discover what we call 5 stages. The pre-awareness stage, and I'm just going to use bias as an easy example and entry point. Pre-awareness, which is the condition of being unaware, for example, we're unaware that we're biased about a certain area. Awareness, which of course is the condition of becoming aware. You become aware that, oh my, I may be biased in this area. Acceptance, which is the condition of accepting the validity and relevance and aptness of being biased for, in this case, the judicial function. Following acceptance, there's another stage, which is a stage of choice. And that is a stage where one freely chooses to modify and change pre-awareness attitudes and behaviors to bring them in line with what is accepted and desired values. And this is where the aspect of integrity comes in. And the 5th stage is action, because even after choice, we still have to make the decision and to act on it. And that is taking steps to actualize one's acceptance of the pre-awareness stage, and of course, by an act of volition and choice, taking an action to change. So that's how we see behavioral change from a judicial educator's perspective, and that's been our experience of how it happens, stages. Some time ago, Scottish psychiatrist Dr. R.D. Laing made the observation that the range of what we think and do is limited by what we fail to notice. And because we fail to notice that we fail to notice, there is little we can do to change until we notice how failing to notice shapes our thoughts and deeds. And so this, of course, is speaking to the pre-awareness to awareness shift. Well, in about 2018 to 2019, I, together with Elron Elahi, who is the research and programming coordinator at the Caribbean Association of Judicial Officers, and Richard Jamada, who's a federal judge in the United States, decided that we wanted to do some investigation into mindful judging and exploring the impact of intentional awareness on the performance of judicial officers in the courtroom. Focus of the research was clearly on intentional awareness bringing together both intentionality and awareness and on procedural fairness. Court users, because at the end of the day, courts and judges exist to serve the needs of our customers, who are court users, the public. And procedural fairness research suggests that court users have increased public trust and confidence when they have a sense of voice, when they can trust authorities, when they understand what is happening, and when they have access to amenities, feel included, and so on. We used Ken Wilber, an American philosopher's 4-quadrant model, and this basically says that reality can be observed, interpreted, and analyzed in 4 quadrants, or from 4 basic perspectives. From the individual perspective, the inside of the individual, the inner and outer. And from the collective, that is to say the community, or in the context of court systems, the court system, from the internal court values, systems, etc., and of course, what manifests externally. So that was the framework. Therefore, for judicial officers, the research focused on trying to make them intentionally aware about what was happening within them, what was also happening outside of them, how they were conducting themselves in court. Together with that, with their awareness about what was happening all around them in the courtroom, the environment in which judicial officers do their work, and also the inner collective, what were the values, whether they were cultural, sociological, systemic, or ideological, that infuse the judicial culture. This is just a graphic that gives you a visual what four-quadrant model that we applied. The research followed 3 basic stages. We did a baseline survey before anybody started anything, and that baseline survey was really to examine and try to document the levels of existing awareness in the participants. Then we gave 2 practices. One practice was intended to try and develop internal awareness and capacity, and the other external awareness and capacity. They were requested to do these 2 practices twice a day for a period of 27 days. Then at the end of that, we administered an exit survey. It mirrored the baseline survey with some additional questions to ask about their experiences around the practice of what we called mindfulness as intentional awareness. And just to be clear, for the purpose of the research, mindfulness was nothing more than being intentionally fully aware, moment to moment, non-judgmentally about whatever was happening. So that's sort of within the standard definition. John Kabat-Zinn has made it very popular in the West. Key findings: 94% found the practice of mindfulness useful, but very significantly, 78% found an increase in awareness of thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And I'm going to try and show the significance of that to judicial function in a moment. So increases in awareness in thoughts, emotions, and behavior. And very, very encouragingly, 94% said they would be committed to continue the practice. Such was the impact on them. For the cross-section of those who participated, 94% found the practice either useful or very useful. Now, judicial officers play 2 primary roles. They are finders of fact and interpreters of law. We all know that, those of us who are judicial officers. So what did the research specifically try to look at? And I'm just going to share just a few little tidbits of it because time is limited. In relation to perception and analysis of facts, to what extent are you aware of how this is the judicial officer's values, beliefs, biases, stereotypes, could affect that? Before and after, following the practice for 27 days, there were significant increases in judicial officers' awareness of how these internal values were impacting perception and analysis of facts. This was repeated in relation to interpretation and application of the law, and the findings were similar as the graph shows. Post-practice increases in awareness. One judicial officer remarked, the practice has increased my alertness to the fact that the mind easily focuses on what the person as an individual believes. It is important to be aware of this and open to other possibilities. So we see the shift that has happened for this participant. Then we examined another area, and that is to say, to what extent are you aware that you are shaped and influenced by your own contextually prevailing local, social, and cultural values, beliefs, biases, etc. And it's very important because every judicial officer comes out of an environment, is inculturated into an environment, and sits in that environment. But in the modern world where it is a very much multicultural, etc., we have to judge and be decision makers in relation to context, cultures, values that are different from us. And so the question was, the examination was, well, to what extent are you aware of these things? And significantly, post-practice, there was increased awareness. One participant shared, it has made me much more aware of the impact of what I think and feel on what I do and the impact that has on the judicial process. So already we are seeing results that show that simply by the practice of intentional awareness participants will be becoming increasingly aware not only of what they were thinking, but of the impact it had on the judicial process. For us, change is premised on choice, and choice is facilitated by awareness. That's the pre-awareness to awareness shift. Court users, the focus of all of the work that we do ought to be, and in court, in the courtroom. To what extent are you fully aware and sensitive to court users? Again, the results are the same. Post-practice, much more aware. Very important, because the procedural fairness research shows that if you are not aware of court users, if you're not sensitive to their needs, to giving them opportunities to be meaningfully heard, to participate in proceedings, to attend to their legitimate needs, to make sure that they understand what's happening, then public trust and confidence diminishes. So this is a very important finding. Transformation, therefore, is possible. And as one participant also shared, mindfulness has led to, I quote, an increase in awareness of how verbal and non-verbal communication, thoughts, actions can influence how I perform my duties in the court space. Lasting impact. As I said, 94 found the practice meaningful, 88% wanted to learn more, and 88 would recommend the practice. Key conclusions, these are just a few. Regular practice of intentional awareness can lead to improved and enhanced courtroom function and experience. It can lead to marked increases in self-awareness of the internal and external aspects of the judicial officer's values and behavior, and also similarly in relation to court users and court systems. Clearly it can be taught because over 27 days these shifts occurred. In 2020, the Harvard Psychiatry Review published an article on mindfulness and behavior change, and this is just a little snippet from it. It concludes that there is a growing evidence base that supports the benefit of mindfulness for behavioral change. And so in a very real sense, mindfulness is speaking to self-regulation in terms of the ability to adaptively regulate attention, emotions, cognition, behavior, and to respond effectively to both internal as well as external stimuli, events, and demands and expectations. Therefore, it has, from our research, clearly demonstrated that it can shift between the pre-awareness and awareness stages. It can create a shift from pre-awareness to awareness in aspects that directly impact core judicial functions, including fact-finding, interpretation of law, and sensitivity to court users, and therefore procedural fairness standards. This research, of course, is preliminary, and I think it invites further consideration. But I just thought, and I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to share it with you in this Behavioral Science Week that United Nations is hosting, and to GGIN for the opportunity to share it. It does have implications for judicial wellness, but we don't have the time to look at that today, and I thought I would just focus on this aspect. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter, Tatiana, Carly, and Sally. And now we have about 10 minutes or so for some Q&A and discussion. So I got to start you off with a question, which is actually somewhat related to this last comment that we have in the chat. So let me just read this from Aneta. She says, "Greetings from the Regional Anti-Corruption Initiative. We run a summer school for young judges and prosecutors from the Southeastern Europe. Those topics are very novel and interesting and could definitely become a part of our annual training," which I think is great. And so my question is, can you share with us a program that's already in place, or maybe just about to be in place, in which these issues and principles that you just talked about are already implemented? Yeah.
I might jump in first, and Sally, please join, and it'd be great to hear from others as well. So Victoria is probably 7 or 8 years into our journey of trying to implement wellbeing programs and training and other initiatives for the judges of our state. And it all started with an educational event, which was really an opportunity for judges to come together and speak about the human dimension of judging together. So creating the conditions where that was possible. And that then, I guess, created a kind of environment where we could start to explore some other topics. So we've looked at systemic responses and also judicial peer support in large programs. And part of the systemic responses has included thinking about ways of reducing the unnecessary sources of stress in judicial work. So some of that is looking at workload, looking at how different parts of the court interact with each other in ways that can create some unnecessary stress. And other aspects of it is thinking about how we can support judges to manage the irreducible sources of stress in their work. And that one example, there's a number, but one example is that several courts in Victoria now have in place programs of proactive debriefing and counselling, so that judges and magistrates meet, say, 4 times a year with one of several carefully selected mental health professionals, build a relationship with them as a chance to proactively metabolise the stress of the work. But it also means that if there's an acute period of stress that comes up, either in their private life or in the work, they've got that established relationship to work through it. So that's one example. You're probably thinking of others, Sally.
Yeah, my mind went to a day program, a full day program that we have developed for new appointees, so judges who are within the first year of being appointed. And we spend a day in a small group of about 20 people and talk about the different wellbeing domains. So think about the kind of occupational domain, the role of being a judge, what are some of the stressors in that, what are some strategies to respond to that. Think about the cognitive domain, maintaining cognitive health, physical domain, the emotional domain, the social domain, and the spiritual and meaning and purpose domain. So we spend a day in a small group talking about how the stressors in judicial life can play out in all of those areas, and then learn strategies, and Carly and I teach strategies about how to maintain health in all those areas. And what I think is really rich in those days is that people have conversations in either pairs or groups of 3 that really build relationships that are very open, and they become a cohort that support each other from the beginning of their career. So that was one that came to mind for me. We're sort of interested in focusing on different stress points in the judicial career, and we know that early on is a time of a lot of challenge, the middle years of once people have mastered the role, and then as they approach retirement from the bench. So we sort of think about different programs in terms of education at those points.
Yeah, Tali, if I could just share what's happening in our region in the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, you know, we've been doing this in a more eclectic way, but we've been doing programs. Our own research revealed that similar things, and so we've been doing interventions, but including things like yoga for judges, very well received. You know, bringing in mental health experts to have conversations. In fact, through the Commonwealth Judicial Education Institute, a standing program for our ISP, and that has been rolled out in the Caribbean, has used an expert from Dalhousie, a psychiatrist, who comes in and speaks to judicial officers about these kinds of issues. And the interesting thing is, of all the programs that we have, his is always sold out. There's only standing room only, and that in itself speaks to, you know, when you said that judges are reticent to speak up about this, but they turn up at the sessions in great numbers. So just to say that certainly in the Caribbean region, I wouldn't bother to go through the details, but we've been consistently addressing many levels, including body work, which I suppose, as you know, is very, very important. So, yeah.
Great, thank you.
If I may add to this,
yes, Tatiana.
So it's really wonderful to hear about the experiences of Australia and in the Caribbean region. These are really great practices. We see at the global level that there are still many judiciaries where the concept of judicial well-being is being unheard of. There is zero training provided on the topic, and this is really something that in the network we want to help judiciaries. We want to promote the topic, help collect these good practices so the judiciaries that don't have yet experiences with the topic could develop some effective training curricula. There was one answer in the survey that I now remember, where one survey participant said that he thinks that training is excellent, but it needs to be really practical and helpful, because he's so busy that if it's only theory that he can't apply, then he would actually prefer not to undergo it, because it's only additional work for him and additional stress as such.
Great. Thank you for that. So I think we could spend the last few minutes answering these two related questions about the pandemic and how that has changed some of the work of the judges. So we have the first question here from Greeley, who says, we have worked with our judges on remote judging and noted the added stressors and pressures when dealing with cases online or virtually. Do you know any specific research in this area, in particular how judges need to develop how they read the virtual court and pick up on social behavioral cues? And she says, thanks, good session. And then we had a related question here. Have any wellness surveys been conducted or planned to address the unique challenges of judicial work during the pandemic, working from home, working virtually, etc.?
Well, I can again say that what prompted our research was the onset of the pandemic in the Caribbean. And that research is available and is on our website, our findings and the impact of the pandemic. I think, Tatiana, your research was very much focused on that, and I think you have specific questions that address that I suppose you will share with everyone.
Indeed, Peter, thank you for mentioning that. There is a dedicated chapter in our global survey to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, also focusing on the opportunities and challenges related to the use of new technologies, working from home, infrastructure that the judiciary does or does not provide, etc. I will link again to the report in the chat for those who maybe came a little bit later.
Yeah, the thing that came to mind for me about the pandemic and the unique challenges, the way we've been thinking about that in Victoria, was we haven't done survey or research about this window of time, but we've certainly heard from our judges that whilst input from psychologists and health professionals is really helpful, what they actually have wanted throughout is leaders who are able to connect with them, understand their working conditions, really genuinely and personally support them and link them with each other. Be brave to ask questions about well-being, be brave to ask questions about what's really challenging, and to directly address that. So we've been supporting leaders to feel like they have permission, authority and skills to do that piece of work, and that's been a real focus for us over the last 18 months.
I think that's something worth underlining, because I think, you know, the mindset of the judicial officer that you are sort of perfect in a way, and so to be vulnerable is a weakness or perceived weakness. And I think the leadership to open and create a safe space for the conversations is very, very important. Yes, and I agree that, you know, we have to work with the chief judges and administrators to make space and room for this, because there are certainly, again, in our region, I know anecdotally of quite a few instances where there are persons who have been diagnosed with mental health illnesses and simply will not talk about them, you know. And continue to work, right? And continue to work.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'll just add that even before the pandemic, my experience of having worked on this topic with a range of jurisdictions, both around Australia and elsewhere, my experience has been that when there is the unequivocal support from the head of jurisdiction and the highest judicial echelons within the court for a discussion and a organised response for wellbeing, that's where you see the change. Without that support, it's very hard for committed judges within the body of the court to create the kind of change that's necessary.
Tali, can I just say something that, you know, the thing about judicial leadership is that if the request is made just anecdotally, it's easier to ignore. And I think with the value of what's happened in Australia, I think the value of what GJIN has done, and even what we have done through CAJU, is that because when we do our research, we send it to what we call heads of judiciary. That's in the Caribbean region. We send our research to the heads of judiciary. And I think when it is research or evidence-based, then it is much, I don't want to say more difficult to ignore. I think it's embraced more willingly. And so I just really want to commend, as we begin to close off, I imagine, I want to really commend GJIN for doing this globally, because I think this is a leverage point. This is really the research can be a real leverage point on this very important issue.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone. We still have comments and questions, but I think we're just out of time. But I believe there's some contact information and as well information about the research and suggestions online for people to connect. So thank you so much for our speakers and for the great questions and comments in the audience. Thank you, everyone.